Once upon a time, there was a little engine called Edward. He lived in a shed with 5 other engines. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it. The driver won't choose you again, they said. He wants big, strong engines like us. Edward had not been out for a long time. He began to feel sad. Just then, the driver and fireman came along to start work. The driver looked at Edward. "Why are you sad?" he asked. "Would you like to come out today?" "Yes, please," said Edward. So the fireman lit the fire and made a nice lot of steam. Then the driver pulled the lever and Edward puffed away. He whistled. "Look at me now." The others were very cross, being left behind.
Edward is the one that started it all, both in the series in general and in my collection. Edward is my favorite character, and back in 2019, I really wanted to make a model depicting him in a realistic form. Since I was brand new to modeling, I didn't want to really use a kit, and I wanted to stick to whatever was available ready to run for him. So I saw it as a fun challenge. What was the closest model on the market that looked like Edward as depicted in the Railway series illustrations? Well, sadly, there aren't many options. The iOS book states Edward is a heavily rebuilt Furness Railway K2. And unfortunately, there are no K2s on the market, let alone unique heavily rebuilt ones with inexplicable NER-styled cabs. Why does every main character on Sodor have to be some weird one-off? Is anyone else put off by that, or is it just me? There are lots of 440s and 00 gauge, but every single one of them has something about them that is just a little too different from Edward for me. The wrong cab, the wrong firebox, outside valve gear, etc. I landed on the Hornby D16, and it's not perfect either, but it had a lot of unique Edward traits that most others didn't. Specifically the cab style, the correct firebox, and the large amount of space between footplate and boiler. The main inconsistencies of the D16 were the short funnel, wrong tender, and it has this very classy looking slope in the footplate above the drivers that obviously is not an Edward trait. But I decided to go with it anyways and make do. There was a D16 on Rails of Sheffield on bargain at the time, so I jumped on it. And in December, it finally arrived, and work on Edward commenced. I did a Photoshop of the D16 as Edward sometime prior, and this is what I used as reference when putting together my model. So the first major thing that had to be taken care of was the tender. The D16's tender wasn't going to fly for Edward, so I had to make do with another one. I had a spare old Bachmann N-Class that I decided to use the tender from. Without the tender, it just became an engine I'd used for spare parts, of which I would eventually rip the pony truck off of for James. Looks-wise, the N-Class tender fit the part really well in my opinion, but it posed a problem. The D16's tender had power pickups. Power pickups are little pieces of metal that touch the tender wheels, so more wheels on the engine gain electricity from the rails. The wheels aren't powered, but more wheels with pickups ensures smoother running, so the engine doesn't stick on points or gaps between rails. Hornby's models are set up so that if you remove the pickups extension from the main motor, the motor won't work. So I couldn't just snip the wire to the pickups. I had to actually keep it intact. There is probably a way to severe the wire and solder it so it will still work, but remember, this was my first model and I didn't really know how to do any of that. So I didn't have a choice and had to keep the pickups intact somehow. So I took apart the D16 tender and pulled up the pickups from it, and then just kind of stuck what I could inside the N-Class tender. There's this little block where all the pickups come together that unfortunately couldn't fit inside the tender, so I had to hide it in the cab. It's not very pretty, and you can see it very clearly from certain angles, but some cleverly positioned people figures can hide it fairly well. So the tender wheels do not gain power anymore, but it's okay. Luckily, the front drivers are large and spaced out enough that it doesn't see issues running over points. Now, modern Hornby tenders are held to the engine with a drawbar underneath that screws in, while Bachmann's older tenders just sort of couple up with a hook and loop. Obviously, these two are incompatible, being from different companies, so I had to fashion a coupling. I just used a paper clip and bent a loop that I superglued under the tender. I made it just big enough that it can couple and uncouple it easily from the drawbar without it coming loose when in motion. It's over a year later and it's still in place, holding true. So the tender was the hard part. Now for the body modifications and the overall general construction. Then came the paint, and this was the exact same approach I used for Thomas. I sprayed it with Rust-Oleum aged gray primer and then several coats of sapphire blue. And once that was done, I painted the smoke box, cab roof, and footplate black, and the running board and buffer beams red. Lining was, again, water slide strips from Fox. Like Thomas, I originally fitted Edward with a BR crest on his cab sides, but would later remove them. I picked out his handrails and smoke box features with the silver Sharpie, filled his tender with real coal, threw a 2 on his sides, weathered him with coal dust, gave him a coat of matte clear, and boom! Edward was basically done. One of the last things I had to figure out with him was his funnel. The D16s had short stumpy funnels. Obviously this wouldn't fly, so I had to try some alternatives. I had recently bought a Hornby Peckett to use the chassis for Percy, my next model, so the body ended up just being used for spare parts. I used the Peckett funnel on Edward, and for a while, this was his funnel. I liked the copper cap on it, and I kind of liked how old-timey it was, and I thought it suited Edward. But I wasn't super happy with it, as I thought it was just a little too thin for him. I did some online searching and found white metal cast funnels from a shop called Phoenix Precision. I went with the Great Western Hall one, and it perfectly fit the bill. Sanded it, painted it black, and voila! A perfect funnel for this Edward. I know a lot of people don't like the D16 for Edward, and if I'm being perfectly honest with myself, I don't either. If I were to use anything in real life for Edward, my first choice would be the D36. My second choice would be the D40. Neither are available in model form, unfortunately, so the D16 was the best option in my opinion. I will definitely redo Edward someday to make it a bit more accurate. And depending on what people say of the build quality of the Southeastern D-Class that's coming out soon, I may try my hand at modding that, but we'll see. It is made by Dapple after all, and I've never been happy with the 00 purchase from them. For the time being though, I'm really content with my D16 Edward. Seeing through a model's construction from start to finish is so satisfying, especially on your first one ever. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Despite being very inaccurate, this Edward is my favorite model in the collection, just because it was my first, and because, well, it's Edward, and he's just the best. Thank you all for tuning into this installment of Tugs Trains. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye!
I'm going out again tomorrow, he told the other engines that night in the shed. What do you think of that? But he didn't hear what they thought, for he was so tired and happy that he fell asleep at once.